Run Adobe Flash. Allow. It's recording also. ಇವಾಗ ಇದನ್ನ ಪ್ರೀಸೆಟ್ 1 ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ it will focus to podium. Content sharing. Content. Content ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಲ್ಯಾಪ್ಟಾಪ್ ಎಂಟರ್ ಸೆಂಡ್ ಕಂಪ್ಯೂಟರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಟೆಂಟ್ ವಿತ್ ವಿಡಿಯೋ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಇಲ್ಲ ಲಾಗೌಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಬೇಡ ಹಂಗೆ ಇರಲಿ, ನಿಮಗೆ ತಿರ್ಗೇನು ಹಂಗೆ ಇರಲಿ. ಅದು ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್. ಅದು ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಸಾಫ್ಟ್ವೇರ್. ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಸ್ಟಾಪ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಇಲ್ಲ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಬ್ರೌಸರು ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಡಿ. AWS ಅನ್ವಾಂಟೆಡ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇದೆ ನೋಡಿ AWS ತೆಗೆದುಬಿಡಿ. ಯಾರೇನು ಅನ್ವಾಂಟೆಡ್ ಇದೆಯೋ ಎಲ್ಲ ತೆಗೆದುಬಿಡಿ. ಲೀಡ್ ಟು ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಇಲ್ಲ ಅದನ್ನ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಡೋಂಟ್ ಸೇವ್. ಅದು ಡೋಂಟ್ ಸೇವ್ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಡೋಂಟ್ ಸೇವ್ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಇದೆ ನೋಡಿ. ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಈ ಕಡೆ ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಇಲ್ಲ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್. ಡೋಂಟ್ ಸೇವ್. ಇವಾಗ ಇದನ್ನ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ತಗೊಳ್ತಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಇಲ್ಲ ಅದೇ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಹೋಗಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅಷ್ಟೇನಾ? ಓಕೆ. ಬಟ್ ಇದು ಯಾಕೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಟಿಲ್ಟ್ ಆದಂಗಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ? ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಟಿಲ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿದೆಯಾ? ಈ ಕಡೆ ಹಿಂಗಿದೆ. ಒಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಸ್ಟ್ರೈಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಸ್ಟ್ರೈಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಹಿಂಗಿದೆಲ್ಲ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಅಲ್ಲ ಝೂಮ್ ಔಟ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಇವಾಗ ನಾನು ಇದು ಆ ಲೈನು ಸ್ಕ್ರೀನ್ ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು, ಅದು ನೋಡಿ ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಹಿಂಗೆ ಡೌನ್ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಈ ಕಡೆ, ಅದು ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತಾನೆ ನೀವು ಸರಿ ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಬರ್ಬೇಕು ಅದು. ಹಂಗೆ ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಬರ್ಬೇಕು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಇದು ಕಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಝೂಮ್ ಔಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಬಿಡಿ, ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಡಿ ಸರಿ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಅದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಟಿಲ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಹೋಗಿ. ಇದು ಕ್ವಾಲಿಟಿನೇ ಇದೆಯಾ ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ದು? ಕ್ವಾಲಿಟಿ ಸರಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಹೋಗಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್. ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಆನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನೀವು ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾನಿಟರ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಕಾಲ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ಬರಲ್ಲ, ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾನಿಟರ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರಿ. ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾನಿಟರ್ ಹಂಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ ನಿಮಗೆ. ಓಕೆ,
ಈಗ ಅದು ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಆಗುತ್ತಲ್ಲ, ಅದು
ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್
ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತ್ರ ನಾವು ಲಾಗ್ ಔಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
ಇಲ್ಲಿ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ ನಿಮಗೆ. ಇದು ಲೈಫ್ ಸೈಜ್ ವಿಡಿಯೋ ಅಂತ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ, ಇದು ಹೋಗ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ. ಇವಾಗ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಇವಾಗ ಕಾಲ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಕಾಣಿಸಲ್ಲ, ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ಮಾತ್ರ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಅವರು ಇವತ್ತು ಕಾನ್ಫರ್ಮ್ ಕಾಲ್ ಇಸ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕನೆಕ್ಟೆಡ್. ಆ ಥರ ಡಿಸ್ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನನಗೆ ಇಮಿಡಿಯೇಟ್ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ನಾನು ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕಾಲ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ, ಆಫೀಸಿಂದನೇ ಕಾಲ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಹಾಂ, ಬ್ಯಾಟ್ರಿ ಇಲ್ಲ 15 ಮಿನಿಟ್ಸ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಅದು ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಫುಲ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಇವಾಗೆಲ್ಲ ಸೆಟ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದಾಗ ಆನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಏನು ಒಂದು 5 ನಿಮಿಷ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ, ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಆನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಅವರು ಇಂಟ್ರೊಡ್ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೊಂದು ಮೈಕ್ ಕೊಡಿ. ಮಿಕ್ಕಿದ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಫೋಕಸ್ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಹಂಗೆ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಚೇಂಜರ್ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಇದೆ, ಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ USB ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಟಾಕ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್. ಟೈಮರು ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಓಕೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟರೆ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಷ್ಟೇ, ಬೇರೆ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ. 50 ಮಿನಿಟ್ಸ್. ಹಾಂ, 50 ಮಿನಿಟ್ಸ್. ಅವ್ರು ಬರುವಾಗ ಇದನ್ನು ಡಿಸ್ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ಬಿಡಿ, ಇದನ್ನು ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಇದು ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಇರಲಿ ಚಾರ್ಜ್. ಇದು ಇವಾಗ ಇದು ಆಫ್ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಆಫ್ ಆಗೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಇದೇ ಮೈನ್ ಮಾಸ್ಟರ್. ಮಾಸ್ಟರ್ ಇದೆ, ಇದೇನಿರುತ್ತೋ ಅದೇ ಥರ ಅದು ಕೇಳುತ್ತೆ. ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ನೋಡಿ, ಆಫ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಆಫ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಲೆವೆಲ್ ಮೈ ಬ್ಯಾಟ್ರಿ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹಾಕ್ಬೇಕು, ಹಿಂಗೆ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಟನ್ ಇದೆ, ಬಟನ್ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿಡಿ, ಇಲ್ಲಾಂದರೆ 20 ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ ಆಫ್ ಆಗೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಆನ್ಸರ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಮೈಕ್ ಬೇಕಂದರೆ ಕೊಡಿ. ಯಾರು ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಕೆಲವ್ರು ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಕೆಲವ್ರು ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರು ಏನಾದ್ರು ತೊಗೊಂಡೋಗಿ ಬೇಡ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ. ಸ್ಲೋ ಆಗಿ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಟೈಮ್ ಆಯ್ತಲ್ಲ, 3:40. ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತಲ್ಲ? ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು. ಇದೇ ರೆಗ್ಯುಲರ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಲೆಕ್ಚರ್ಸ್ಗೂ. ಕೆಲವು ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಕೆಲವ್ರಿಗೆ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಅದು ನಮ್ಮ
ಅವ್ರು ಮೇಲ್ ಆಗ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ
ಅವ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಆಗ್ತಾರೆ, ರೆಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಮೇಲೆ ಆಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ರೆಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು.
ಕೇಳಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನ್
ಪಾಸ್ವರ್ಡ್ ಅದು ಬರೆದು ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ನಾನು ಮೆಸೇಜ್ ಕಳಿಸ್ತೀನಿ ಇಬ್ಬರಿಗೂ. ಆ ಪಾಸ್ವರ್ಡ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಕಡೆ ನೋಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ಯಾವಾಗಲೂ ಲಾಗಿನ್ ಪಾಸ್ವರ್ಡ್ ಅದೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಕಾಮನ್ ಐ ಡಿ ಕೊಡೋಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಡೆಸ್ಕ್ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಅದ್ರದ್ದು ಐ ಡಿ ಮತ್ತು ಪಾಸ್ವರ್ಡ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಅದು ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಟಿಕೆಟ್ಸ್ ಏನೇನಿದೆಯೋ ಡೇ ಟು ಡೇ ನೋಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಿಫೋರ್ ಗೋಯಿಂಗ್. ಓಕೆ,
ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬೋರ್ಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಬೋರ್ಡಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತೀನಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಫೋಟೋ ಕಾಪಿ ವಾಟ್ಸಪ್.
ಸೊ ನೀವು LH1 ನೋಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ನೀವು 4:40 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತೀರಾ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ 6:30 ಅಗೇನ್ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಕೈಪ್ ಇದೆ. ಇದು ಮುಗಿಸಿದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಸ್ಕೈಪ್ ಐಟಮ್ಸ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡು ಮೈಟೊಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ?
ಗೊತ್ತು.
ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಡಿ,
ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಆಪೋಸಿಟ್
ಮಲ್ಗೋಗ ಆಪೋಸಿಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಡಿ. ನಾನು ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತೀನಿ, ಸ್ಟಾಟಿಕ್ ಐ ಪಿ ಎಸ್ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅಸೈನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು 6:30 ಏನೋ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ ಸ್ಕೈಪ್. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ತೊಗೊಂಬಂದ್ವಲ್ಲ ಲ್ಯಾಪ್ಟಾಪು
ಆಗ್ತಾ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಇಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಅವ್ರ ಲ್ಯಾಪ್ಟಾಪ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ ಅವರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ಜೇಬ್ರಾ ಒಂದು ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ.
ಹಾಂ, ಜಾಬ್ರಾ ಮತ್ತು ಒಂದು ವೆಬ್ ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಲ್ಯಾಪ್ಟಾಪ್, ಒಂದು ಚಾರ್ಜರ್ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಬಂದೆ, ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತೀನಿ ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ LH1 ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತಾಗಿ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಇದ್ರೆ 6000 ಇರ್ತೀನಿ ನಾನು.
6000?
6000.
ಓಕೆ.
ನೀವು ಇಬ್ಬರು ಇರ್ತಿರಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ಒಬ್ಬರು ಬಂದು ನಂಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ರಿಸೆಪ್ಷನ್ ಇಂದ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನಾನು ಬರ್ತೀನಿ ಅವರು.
ಓಕೆ.
ಏನು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಗಲ್ಲ, ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಬಂದಿದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಪ್ರೊಜೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಆನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡಿ, ಡಿಸ್ಪ್ಲೇ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಮೈಕ್ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಟಾಕ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ ಚೇಂಜರ್ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಟ್ಯಾಬ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಡೋದನ್ನ ಮರಿಬೇಡಿ. ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅದಲ್ಲಿ 1 hour ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ವಿದೌಟ್ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಮಾಸ್ಟರ್ನ ಮಾತ್ರ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಮರಿಬೇಡಿ. ಅದ್ರದ್ದು ಓರಿಯಂಟೇಷನ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಡಿ. ಮಾಸ್ಟರ್ದು ಓರಿಯಂಟೇಷನ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲೂ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಗಿಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ.
ಓಕೆ ಓಕೆ,
ಕೇರ್ಫುಲ್. ಅದು ಹೆಂಗಿದೆಯೋ ಹಂಗೆ ಸೈಡಿಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡು ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ.
ಅದು ಚೇಂಜ್ ಬಂತು ಮುಗಿಸಿ.
டைம் அதெல்லாம் லேட்டா, அதெல்லாம் வந்து டெய்லியும் நீங்கள் அந்த சைன் போட்டுருங்க. இங்கே கூட இருக்குது நோட்டு, அதுலேயும் சைன் போட்டு அது ஒரு காப்பி எடுத்து வச்சுக்கோங்க, ஃபோட்டோ காப்பி. அதே மாதிரி நீங்களும் டைரியில் எடுத்து வச்சுக்கோங்க, என்னைக்கு எவ்வளோ டைரக்டர் வரும் அப்படின்ட்டு. அதுக்கு தகுந்த மாதிரி உங்களுக்கு இது பண்ண சொல்கிறாங்க எக்ஸ்ட்ரா. சும்மா சொல்கிறாங்க, நம்ம இதுக்கு பரவாயில்ல அப்படின்னு நினச்சிக்கிட்டோம்.
நான் ஃபஸ்ட்டு வந்தப்பயே அந்த இது முடிச்சோம்ல, ஃபினான்ஸ் எபால் அது பர்ஃபெக்டாக முடிச்சுன்னு சொல்லிட்டு அப்பயே வந்து ஒரு இன்சென்டிவ் வாங்கிட்டேன். சரி சிவாகர் சரி ஓகே அப்படின்னு. அடுத்தது திருப்பும் இப்போ ரீசெண்டாக இதுனதுக்கு டைட்டான் முடிச்சிட்டு இது இப்போ போடுறேன்.
இவங்க மெயில் போட்டால் எல்லாம்
இவர் மெயில் போடல.
லேட் ஆகும். இது மெயிலில் போட்டுவிட்லாம் நம்ம இதில் வாட்ஸ்அப்பில் லாஸ்ட்டாக இருக்குன்னா எப்போ தெரியல. ஒரு ஃபோட்டோ அனுப்பிவிட்டோம் டெய்லி ஒன்று.
அதெல்லாம் கஷ்டப்பட்டு எதனா ஒன்று கொடுத்தா தான் அந்த நமக்கும் சேஃப்டி இதாக இருக்கும்.
நமக்கு டைமிங்கே கொஞ்சம் டவுன் நெட்ஒர்க் 8 o'clock வந்தாலும்
Locate. Start. Off again. Switch.
minutes because people from campus are the slowest to come.
But that's true all over the world.
Don't mind me asking a random question. How many of you are coming? I guess most of you are coming from off campus, right? Do you face issues when you enter campus, like at the gate, in terms of security? Few people have been telling me that they like security is fierce on campus. I don't know because.
But I mean, can we also help with some process or something that it makes it easier for people?
Yeah, we could, but I don't know where to set it up from. I mean, I guess one could set it up from IAC, but the shuttle time is actually, matches well with this. So
maybe you could just put that into the notice.
Notice, yeah.
The security gents are aware of this lecture. I have to sort of show them.
So what this part because I have I have an algorithm. On Thursday the notice goes to security saying lecture on Tuesday. Because they told me to do so. But
maybe there's so many visitors, we could just get a quick intro of people that might also be nice if you have 5 minutes.
Like just around here?
Yeah, just to know where people are coming from.
Does anyone want to do that? Shout out how you found out about this, where you're coming from. Facebook. Okay.
But it's just nice for us to know. And
good to know.
When did you start?
I'm a new faculty at NCBS, so
okay.
I saw the poster.
I've recently started getting associated with Hippo Learning Campus.
Sorry, could you say that a little louder, please?
I've recently started getting associated with Hippo Learning Campus, which caters to a lot of schooling in the rural parts of Karnataka and Maharashtra. And I got to know of this through the CEO of this.
Sorry, how did you find out?
I came to hear about this from Anil, who is the CEO of Hippo Learning Campus.
Okay.
And their focus is on education in
Nice.
rural India. And I'm trying to focus on the education sector after corporate life.
Thank you.
I mean, you could do it after also, just cutting into your time. It is nice to know.
The moment I see at least 10 NCBS faces is like my trigger to like, okay, fine, I think we're good.
Have you got your title?
I see a few NCBS faces. One more NCBS face. Good. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But I typically start around 4:04.
How far is it? How long does it take to get it?
Though I'm doing a lot of stuff that is more academic category.
know that you are sort of part of this archive. Traffic is not too bad.
Yeah, this time of the day, I haven't experienced too much of it because I've been in your
Bangalore, a big challenge is
But what's your sort of beyond that? I mean, that direction there's not that much traffic. ICTS, the rest is sparse and pretty.
you have to cross Canada, drive over. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have it.
Yeah.
Anybody who's crossed Canada.
Here you go, cross all the traffic, but I think ICTS is.
Okay, guys, I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for coming. This is the 9th in the Archive Public Lecture series. Again, as a matter of protocol, I have to say that for those of you who don't know, we have an archive coming up. We should be open early next year. And the lecture series is one of the activities we try and do to just get some conversation across different silos in the community. So really, really grateful that you guys are here. It's also my particular pleasure to introduce Jyotsna. We've been having this conversation for some time, so I'm thrilled that she's been able to make it today. A brief introduction. Jyotsna Jha presently heads the Center for Budget and Policy Studies, CBPS, which is located in Baswangadi, Bangalore. CBPS is an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization that focuses on research in gender, education, social and economic policies, budgeting, decentralization, and governance issues. And I understand it's 20 years this year. Fantastic. She's trained as an economist, and Jyotsna has a significant experience of working on development-related issues. Prior to joining CBPS, she worked as an advisor to Social Transformation Programs Division at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, which allowed her to undertake research and policy advocacy in a large number of countries. She served as a member of the Global Advisory Committee for the UN Girls Education Initiative, UNGEI, for 4 years. She has also been a member of several national committees and task forces in India, and she's participated in a number of review missions. Jyotsna has led a number of research institutions, and she has 5 books and several chapters and papers to her credit. She's written extensively, in particular, on the issue of equity in education, in particular on gender in education, which is why we're so grateful that she's able to make the time for today's talk. Jyotsna, over to you.
Okay. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, thanks, Venkat. And hello, everyone. So, basically, I'm here to share a few stories from education policy making rather than education policy. And that's because, you know, like almost for the last 3 decades, I've been active in the area of education. And apart from readings, you also come across several stories from several sources. And when you put them together, that itself makes a good piece of research. So there could be several ways that I could have approached this talk, but I've chosen a few areas and a few stories, I would say. And I'll start with, as Venkat said, I have worked on quite a bit on gender and equity issues, girls' education. So I'll start with that, actually. So, right to education, I'm sure most of you have heard about it. That's something that all of us know. It's recent, and it became an act in 2009, yet to be completely achieved in the sense of every child being in school for at least 8 years of period. But we are aspiring, and we have a justiciable right. It's a fundamental right. And if you look into the right, even as a law and otherwise, the history is traced to the Gokhale bill. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was a freedom fighter, and Gandhi referred to him as his political guru, he had introduced a bill in 1911. And that bill was considered the first universal basic education bill. And you will find that reference in many papers, many books. But most of it doesn't mention that the universe actually did not include girls. That bill actually talked of universal primary education only for boys. And how do you get to know? Because most of the published books actually, if you try to understand the history of universal basic education in India, you will not find this being mentioned. Only when you go to the original bill, you realize that. And how do you go to original bill? I mean, I happened to review a book which was a collection of original document, and that's how I got to know. And this, the most interesting part is about this, if you look at, more and more original documents around that period, that this was defended by almost all, hardly critiqued, despite the and on grounds of money, because the argument was that if we ask for universal including girls, then the British government will not actually listen to us, and therefore it makes sense to leave girls out. And this was despite the fact that Baroda state had already introduced a free and compulsory education bill in 1906, and that included girls. It was meant for girls between 6 and 10 and boys 6 and 12, and in 5 years it had actually led to unprecedented growth in enrollment of girls. Already about almost 50% of girls in Baroda state had been enrolled. Despite that positive response in one of the princely estates, and one of the important princely estates of that time, that was not considered. In fact, if you go again deeper, then this is perhaps one of the few issues. Caste was another, and in today's talk I have not gone into that. But girls' education, especially on the issue around the girlhood, was the most contested one among the freedom fighters, among those who were in some ways preparing for the country's independence and trying to shape the education policy of an independent India. And here I will actually like to read a few quotes, because that's important. There are many actually, but as I've chosen a few. Dayal Singh, he was a very noted educationist of his time, and there are several institutions in northern India, and he was from Lahore, and very influential in terms of education policy, shaping education. He was a philanthropist. He was very modern. He actually he has argued very well for Indian languages, use of Urdu and Punjabi instead of Persian, and many actually, and established many institutions. But when it comes to girls' education, what he submitted to Education Commission was, the object of female education in the country is not to make sound scholars, but to make better mothers, sisters and wives. Then Sir Said Ahmad Khan, who is known for establishing Aligarh Muslim University, he says he advised the government, again the same Education Commission, to concentrate its efforts in adopting measures for education and enlightenment of Mohammedan boys. The present state of education among Mohammedan females is enough for domestic happiness. 40 years later, actually, Tilak, on the right, he says, he actually goes further, further from mothers and wives and daughters. A Hindu girl must grow to be a good daughter-in-law, in addition to being a good wife, a good mother. We must provide our girls with a fair knowledge of hygiene, domestic economy, child nursing, cooking, sewing and so forth. And Arya Samaj, again, very formally argued to introduce, even in higher education, only needlework, cooking and knitting instead of big books of history and geography that are completely useless to women. I'm quoting. Not that these were the only voices, but these were very, very prominent voices. And there were varying voices, of course. That's why we kind of managed to get away from it to a certain extent only. But there was Brahmo Samaj in Bengal, again, has actually argued for women's education. And Lala Lajpat Rai, who is there in the middle, 40 years later, early 20th century, he writes, it's actually a very good piece of writing if you go to the original document. Boys and girls should be treated as comrades rather than dependents and inferiors. and subordinates. So you see this contestation very, very strongly, very, very passionate debates and arguments within our leaders, and different kinds of pamphlets, letters, submissions to various commissions were there. And what was interesting, that even those who were otherwise united on many other questions were divided here when it came to women's education, girls' education. But finally, of course, our constitution talked of universal, included girls, included everybody else, and so obviously there were those voices as well, and to a large extent, if you go into those debates later, then perhaps Nehru and Ambedkar need to be credited with. Then post-independence. Now, how did we manage? Many of us will argue, and we continue to argue, that many things that we are talking about, these statements, they may not be existing today in a formal way, may not be in actually, you may actually find people formally arguing for that, not yet in the policies, but you do see them even today. But how did we manage to get away formally from that? What is it? And although it has remained ambiguous, formally we have an education which is trying to give equal access and also promote equality through education. Now, how did we manage? Especially one example that I'm going to talk about is of a particular program of women's empowerment called Mahila Samakhya, which was introduced in 1989. And how did we reach there? That's a program. If I'll tell you a brief about the program also, but more about how we really managed to reach there. How did we manage to have a program of Mahila Samakhya which was based on feminist principles, which actually questions almost everything that we had till then on the name of girls' education. And it also was very unique in terms of the fact that it allowed processes which were very different. It was based on collectivization, but not like microfinance. And it states as its objective, it actually refers to patriarchy as a barrier and working on that. So how did that happen? How did we manage to have a program like Mahila Samakhya within the Department of Education and within the Department of Education, and actually as part of elementary education, because the whole argument was for program that as long as women do not collectivize and work for girls' education, you will not reach there. And it's not about just having a school there and bringing them to school, but breaking all kinds of barriers of mobility, of confinement, other kinds of unequal practices that you experience at home and outside home, and therefore you have Mahila Samakhya. Mahila Samakhya literally means conversation among equals, so that was the name chosen. Now, how did it happen? It became part of 86 policy and then became a scheme. How did it happen? This is a photograph of actually Mahila Samakhya workers, the ground level workers. The way it works is actually it worked, because the program has now been closed in most places. I'll come to it. It works through collectivization of women, and these are actually called Sahyoginis, and they are the most important part of the whole mechanism of Mahila Samakhya. So when Sahyoginis are identified, they are trained. They are not trained just through a process of a training program, but they are brought together, and the whole long process of reflection, using basically feminist ways of sharing your own life stories, realizing, coming together, and then trying to build their other skills of collectivization, and then going back to their villages and working to collectivize women. And so this is a photograph of a few Sahyoginis from Bihar. So how did it happen? How did we manage to reach there? despite the fact that patriarchy remained very, very strong. But in policy, we aspired, we had a policy. How did we manage to do that? Well, I think it's important to refer to this gentleman called Anil Poda. Some of you may have heard of him. He's quite a well-known name in education policy circles. So Poda was an IS officer, middle class, Stephanian. Why I'm saying all this? Because I think all this matters. He came from a particular socio-cultural background. He came from Rajasthan. His father worked as principal of a very well-known nationalist school started by Mohanlal Mehta, Jagat Mehta. This whole school of, they have this Seva Bhavan and Vidya Mandir. It's active till today. So there was close to Nehru. So came with this background of Gandhian in his thoughts, and Western in terms of his education, liberal views, commitment very committed to feminist thoughts. So he and very committed to education. So he served in education both in Rajasthan and in Government of India, and he's. I mean, if one person has to be credited with Mahila Samakhya and many other things that happened around that time in India, it's not that he alone was responsible, but he was a very important part of the whole story. So Poda worked on Bihar Education Project, which was the first project that looked at primary education as a whole. Till then, in school education we had very fragmented programs. So we had, we'll talk about building schools. So school building grants will be given. Even when Operation Blackboard came, so it's about building that was much more comprehensive than others, but it was again about giving infrastructure and ensuring that teachers are there. So Bihar Education Project in many ways was the first, it was brainchild of Poda, supported by UNICEF in terms of money, and that tried to look at education comprehensively. It went into issues of gender, went into issues of caste, tried to do teacher training very differently. So, in the 70s they started this for example, education secretaries used to serve food in teacher training programs. Everybody will. I know it's part of many institutional culture, but it's definitely not part of the bureaucracy even today. That senior IS officers will wash the plates themselves and also of others. So there are many things that he tried to institutionalize, and Mahila Samakhya also actually emanated out of that. So, and I'll tell you one story about Mahila Samakhya. That was my first exposure, and I think it's an important one. So when I started working, and it was Bihar actually. So I had gone there for some work. It was a workshop, and when the food was served, food was very like home-like food, and I said that, this catering, where have you got it from? It's very good food. It's very like home food. They said it's women's group, and it's Dalit women's group run by Mahila Samakhya. I didn't know about Mahila Samakhya then. So okay, what is Mahila Samakhya? It's a program that has been started, and what's happening? So no, they collectivize women and they focus on Dalits. So Dalit women, and then they have trained them on catering. So cooking is something that women do all the time, but catering is not something they do. And then teachers, school teachers, which till 70s was largely an upper caste, till 80s actually, profession in most states, introducing and almost making compulsory that all teachers workshop, all teacher training program, all teacher training institutions will have catering from Mahila Samakhya groups, was actually intended to break many barriers. It was not only about women's empowerment, it was also to break caste barriers, creating livelihood opportunities, of course, for women. So, therefore, what I'm trying to say that these programs were conceptualized differently as compared to the schemes that existed or exist even today. So, so Bihar Education Project he started, And then he was Joint Secretary in Government of India, and he worked with Narasimha Rao very closely. He was MHRD Minister then, Human Resource Development Minister. And then again he became Education Secretary when Narasimha Rao became PM. So he was he had a good rapport with his political master. And an interesting thing in terms of political economy is this, that he and many of his friends, he was also very much owned by civil society, because many civil society movements he was very much part. Many of his juniors from Stephens, if you talk of Aruna Roy, Banka Roy, many others, they're all belong to the same group. And so he was very much part of the civil society as well. Civil society saw him not as a bureaucrat but one of his own. And he and some of them, like people like Vimla, Ramachandran, Harsh Sethi, these people actually went to jail, anti-emergency. They were very much anti-emergency. When they post-emergency, Bodhya was single-minded in that sense. Despite his opposition to emergency, although he remained a bureaucrat and therefore not in terms of the way his friends participated, but still, he also saw an opportunity when Rajiv Gandhi's decentralization, this 73rd and 74th amendments came, both Panchayati Raj and urban decentralization, his call for a new education policy which will be different. He used that opportunity, and he also used that opportunity to win over friends in women's movement which had actually opposed and was on the forefront of opposing emergency, actually came in and entirely drafted the Mahila Samakhya scheme entirely. So in fact, it's rare to find that becomes the first chapter, actually, education for women's equality in program of action that followed. So between 86 and 92, VP Singh government came, Chandrasekhar government came. He was less active, but he again became, he supported, Ramurthy committee was formed to re-look into 86 policy, and he supported that. He actually did not oppose, and then he again comes back and formulates this. So he played a very, very important role there. This is Shastri Bhavan, Ministry of HRD is located there. Now, and also, used his charm to get external funding. Mahila Samakhya was externally funded, like Bihar Education Project, Netherlands. And why I'm saying use his charms, because when you work in those circles, you actually come across people who remember him for life. They'll talk about him. They'll tell you how they sat in their drawing rooms and worked on the bilateral agreements. So this is how things happen, and this is how things happen. So that's the story of Mahila Samakhya. Now the question arises whether it's only one individual matter. No, of course not. It's not that Bodhya was the only one there. 86 policy, still I think NCF, National Curricular Framework 2005, was perhaps one opportunity where large participation, again he played a major role in designing that process. When meetings will happen in small towns, Mofussil towns, cities, clubs, and all that actually fed to it. A large number of academics, civil society partners were asked to come and present. So that also is part of that. And you also see, and that's not the only way. It's not that the bureaucracy led was the only way, but that has been one major way. Not perhaps in today's circumstance. Bureaucracy is also quite marginalized at the moment, but it did happen in certain periods of time. There were other ways. For example, midday meal. If we look at that became a national universal scheme for the country 2004. Now that came through a Supreme Court order. Supreme Court order on right to food movement. Now, right to food movement was backed by people like Jyotsna, people like Aruna Roy, and PUCL. It was actually a PIL by PUCL, People's Union for Civil Liberties, and a judgment came, and at that time government had money because of the 2% cess first time that had come, and therefore they could afford. So political processes also play a role, but bureaucracy played also a very significant role. Even if you look at midday meal, then you have a number of serving and ex-officers playing a role, be it Aruna Roy, then food commissioners appointed, NC Saxena, Shankaran. Now these are all officers who, out of like hundreds and thousands of serving officers, these are the ones who like people who are active in civil society know well of. Why? Because these were also the people who were arguing for issues that civil society was arguing for. So NC Saxena became the food commissioner appointed by Supreme Court. Shankaran was there, Harsh Mandar was there, who had taken voluntary retirement after Babri Masjid. So bureaucracy does play a role. It did play a role, I would say. And the balance, what is desired, what is not desired, is very difficult. Who is arguing for what actually, I think, makes more sense. The same bureaucracy could be arguing for something which is completely offline, could be arguing for commercialization of education, corporatization of education. So it's not that bureaucracy is always evolved, progressive, and focused towards equity. It all depends who. So individuals do matter, but they alone don't matter. That's how I at least have understood education policy making. Going back to Bodhya, because so this it's interesting to go back, because 92 he retired, and only after he retired the World Bank entered. And believe me, I know how easy or difficult it is to believe. I do feel that's my reading, you know, having spent long years and hours in the corridors of Shastri Bhavan, that he was perhaps one single person, much more than his political bosses, who prevented World Bank from entering the primary education, school education sector entirely. And he was really opposed to World Bank. And I'll share one story from my personal, actually, encounter. Around 2000, 2001, I had an I had a consultancy assignment from World Bank of tracing the education policy evolution in Rajasthan, because Rajasthan had very interesting programs like Lok Zumbesh, WDP, Women's Development Program, and many others, Shiksha Karmi. So in the course of doing that research, I called him. He had retired. He lived in Jaipur. I lived in Delhi then, and he gave me an appointment. And I went to him early morning, and after talking for 10 minutes, he said, it's for the World Bank. So I said yes. He said, then you can't. He started talking. He started telling me about the past, and he said, no, then you can't use any of this. So I'll talk to you, but you will not use it for that particular writing. So I said, then it's very difficult. How do I know and not use? How do I separate the two? If I don't know, if you have not talked to me, it's easier. But if you talk to me and I know all that, how do I separate it from my writing? And he said no. And then I asked him why, and he said that no, see, so World Bank has this habit of getting these young scholars. I was young then. And then when they do a good piece of research, they manipulate it in terms of inferences, and it's not published on their name. So I said, you know, I actually don't disagree even today with him, but I said, in this particular case, I have a contract which says that they will publish it on my name as part of a book, and if they don't do it within 6 months, I have a right to publish it otherwise. So it is going to be in public domain. That's the contract. And I said I can share a copy of a contract with you. I went to the extent of, proving my credibility as someone who had shouted anti-World Bank slogans in Narmada on the, but he didn't budge. And so after that, so I said, okay, then we'll not talk. And we talked about other things, but not education. And so that was his kind of, really he was against, and he would not hear anything that will make him think differently. So after he left in '92, this program, District Primary Education Program, which was the precursor to Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, and this program has many adjectives. It was the largest social sector program supported by the World Bank, largest in the world supported by the British DFID, which was ODA then, largest European Union's social sector program. So basically this was a huge program supported externally. World Bank was one, but the leading partner, almost 80% money came from them. But it's important to put it in perspective, but despite being largest, it was less than 1% of our like India's expenditure, public expenditure on primary education. So that perspective is important. So came after he left, enters World Bank, and then when the World Bank entered, and in fact that's the time I actually got into all this. Just like finished my PhD, and then that's the time they were creating a technical support group, and I became part of that. So also important is that there were two schools. So one of the first things that I encountered when I started working was that there was a particular school of say academics, professionals, civil society, working in education, coming from various disciplines, not education alone, were very opposed to DPEP because it was World Bank, largely. They were fine with DFID, EU, or UN, but not the World Bank. And their argument was that the bank forces, and now it will be a sellout, and it will be a, they'll control everything, curriculum and everything. That is something, again, I found not true. Being part of the government for that period, what I realized that it's not that World Bank is a benevolent or any of these bilaterals, multilaterals, including UN. They all have their own vested interests. But they also go by, it's all about relative power. It's, the way they function, say for example, in a small African, or even, much more in Africa, but even elsewhere. In India, at least in education sector, what I saw was different to an extent. And why? Because they needed it. As I said, it's the largest. It was also their credibility which was at stake. If you're not in India, if you have to see, and it was an IDA loan, development assistance loan, not the bank loan. So it has an element of grant. So you also have to gain credibility. And especially in a phase when they were, in many countries, they were actually getting a very bad name. So credibility was an issue for the bank as well. And therefore, it matters who you're negotiating with. What is your bargaining power? And I have sat through these negotiating tables, and what I saw that many of the Indian bureaucrats who, this is one of those, Brinda Sarup, who were trained well on these things by Anil Poda, thought differently. They were not necessarily anti-bank the way Poda was, but they did negotiate from a position of strength. And therefore, for example, DPEP, there was no way you could have done anything that could, especially through external money or any kind of support on curriculum. So that was a no-no. Even textbook, only content was a no-no. Design was fine, production was fine. Even in context of appraisals, DPP was the first project in the world where all these agencies, bank especially, agreed not to have a bank appraisal but to depend on their own appraisal. So there were many things that Government of India managed to negotiate well, and then it actually was a program that large extent, not entirely, helped. But not entirely. Now, where, for example, one thing where bank and other bilaterals, they were all actually wanting, managed to push through, and government supported, because I think government itself also wanted, was para teachers. In the south, you don't really hear of that. I don't know how many of us here are familiar with that nomenclature, but basically a low paid teacher, not necessarily low qualified, but low paid, and contractual teachers, much lower payment, and calling them para. They were not para in the sense that they were not support teachers, they were full teachers. But teacher shortage has been a big issue in many of the eastern and northern states, and therefore to address that, and these are also the states that do not have enough resources, that their economy sizes are also lower, and therefore these para teachers was pushed, which had long-term adverse effects. I will not go into that. And banks supported, everyone supported, and supported why I'm saying it's not about again money. Money, Government of India or respective state governments were spending much more than anybody else. But also in terms of creating evidence in support of para teachers, creating a kind of public opinion in support of that. So there was a role that they did play. And the urgency, since you can't go for, your economy doesn't allow you to go for full time, so that kind of thing. So that happened. Still, I think when it comes to negotiation, it was interesting to see, and more so because later I did work in many other countries, especially Africa and the Caribbean, and I saw how different it becomes. And interestingly, actually, some of the same individuals who I had dealt with in India were posted there later, and it was interesting to see how they have a very different positioning vis-a-vis national governments in those countries. That's the story. And the next is that, I will try to actually come to Karnataka and then wrap it up, so that we can also have some discussion. So Karnataka, so this DPEP, for example, para teachers. Now, southern states did not go for para teachers, and Karnataka actually really used it to its advantage in terms of experimenting with new ideas. Nalikali was first experimented then. Now today one can take a Nalikali. Okay, Nalikali is a system now Karnataka has institutionalized. Karnataka state schools, first 3 years, children do not really go through the typical textbook-based education. It's more graded cards and other. I mean, they have large. It's diverse set of materials that they use, borrowing from Rishi Valley actually. And there are arguments on both sides in terms of this being good and bad. But whatever it is, the idea was to introduce something which is much more enjoyable and much more enabling in terms of learning for young children. And Karnataka started during DPEP and later institutionalized it. Karnataka was also one state that introduced many institutional reforms. Again, started during that time, but continued on later. And I'll talk about one of those also because, we were talking of institutional memory, and that's actually an interesting story. So teacher recruitment and transfer in elementary education sector is one of the biggest jobs that all state governments have. The interesting thing is that DPP had one conditionality, that states will maintain their expenditure on elementary education. And what what all state governments' finance secretary used to say, that what they don't realize that we will always maintain, because the largest bill, the largest salary bill goes there. Teachers are the biggest, the number is the largest, and therefore the staff salary is the largest. and therefore you always maintain that it doesn't go down. So teachers transfer and recruitment is a huge issue, and it's also a major means of corruption across the country because of rent seeking, because of patronage. In fact, I have witnessed it in Rajasthan, and then the story perhaps is the same everywhere, many states, UP, Bihar, that around summer the transfers happen, and you will see hundreds of teachers roaming around, and you are trying to see which MLA, which minister, and how to pay and how not to pay. So this goes on, and this is and smaller the economy, bigger the contribution of this particular process becomes. In fact, I have a friend who was in the IAS who is also co-author with my book. He has now resigned. He resigned. He was in a SAM cadre. He tried to actually use Karnataka model of teacher transfer, which I'll talk about. And he had Chief Minister's support, who had actually handpicked him to become Education Secretary. And he was actually called on the floor of the assembly and given a censor, official censor, and because it's a big source of income in those economies. So Karnataka, and before starting that, let me tell you this. So Karnataka has introduced a software-based, in 2007, Karnataka passed an act, Teacher Transfer Act, and another is Teacher Recruitment and Placement Act. Around the same time they came. And yeah, so the beauty of the act is that it enables transfer based on very fair parameters. So everything is listed, and it's based on demand. So I, as a teacher, if I have the eligibility, and the eligibility comes from my years of service in rural areas. So if I am eligible, I apply, or any area, years of service, but compulsory service in rural areas. And so I could have served 7 years in urban, but 3 years or 5 years, I think, is the minimum, 5 years in rural, so I am eligible. And I apply, and then there is a criteria. So terminal illness, or suppose my husband, or there are many other criteria. So based on that software, it places me in that list. And that list is made public. I have an access to that. I can object to it if I feel it's not. And based on that, it happens. And when it happens, based on GIS, if there are, say, 50 vacancies, if I am top on the list, I go first, and I get to choose. And once I choose, it's dynamic. That particular place is no more part of the system. It's I have taken it, but my place gets added, and the second one goes and chooses. So it's kind of a fair, equal, inclusive policy that exists, 2007. Now we, in our Center for Budget and Policy Studies, we started a research 2 years ago as part of a national study on teacher management. We were doing 2 states, Karnataka and Jharkhand, and my colleagues who started working on the whole thing, they came back and they said it started in 2007, this, that. And they said that I had kept, telling them that this started in Karnataka in 99. And then they would say that there's no trace of 99, this came in 2007, nothing existed before 99. And then I kind of tried to dig out, and I had actually a published report, which I had done on a case study on Karnataka's teacher transfer and recruitment policy in 99. Since it was, I actually downloaded, I had no copy, I looked, and finally I managed to trace it and I got it. And then we started interrogating, and then we realized that, so he's Karnataka's education minister who was responsible for passing the act, and he played a very major role actually in 2007, very, very important role. We interviewed him, and he actually said that, how it started, and the story has no link with 99 story. So it started with a teacher who had a mentally challenged child, and she needed a transfer, and then it goes on that. But I would look at the policy and I would say I have seen this, a very similar document earlier. I have worked on it, I have written about it. And then we started interviewing older officers. He is Govind Gowda, he was the education minister at the time, the first time it was introduced, but not as an act, but as an office order. Ranganath was education secretary, later became chief secretary, and Anita Kaul, who was heading the DPEP then. So we started interviewing, we interviewed Anita, Ranganath. He couldn't be interviewed because he was very ill that time, and later he passed away. Sanjay Kaul, who was education secretary, again since then retired. They had actually not traced the fact that it was now an act, and the officers and even politicians, they had of course sourced that office order from somewhere. It was the same list, everything was the same, but they could not make any connections. And we interviewed all levels. We went to a number of people who retired, who were instrumental in drafting it at 2007, and everybody said, yeah, perhaps something existed and perhaps we used it, but we have no memory. The list was there. Yes, it was done by, perhaps in Sanjay Kaul's time, but perhaps only once. We don't know about it. But it was actually done for many years, and it's not that old a history, but complete kind of disconnect in two phases, and hardly any institutional linkage other than the fact that it was used. And that was very interesting again for us, that how policy making happens, how you all connect. For example, Ranganath, Anita, Sanjay, all belonging to a particular period, they connect to each other. They'll tell you all stories, how NIC was called. We actually interviewed a number of NIC people who were working then and then later, but everyone thought he or she was the first one to do it, and they did it with passion, with commitment, with competence, yet the linkages were not obvious to them. So that's kind of again an interesting story for me, and it also tells you that how these things happen, how institutional memories do not really, are weak, and there are many things actually. I can go on. There are a number of stories about various policies, that how a particular combination works. Tapas Majumdar Committee report, I was part of the task force, and one incident I'll share. Tapas Majumdar Committee report was, again, well, it's important because it was a committee that was asked to estimate the financial requirements for making right to education a fundamental right, in late 90s. And the committee, it was an expert group, committee decided that we will not go by financial constraints, and there was the other terms of reference to look at also the revenue generation side of it. So the public expenditure side of it, they decided that we'll go by norms, what is desired. And one particular meeting, there were a series of meetings, it went on for 2 years, when teacher-student ratio in primary education, the committee decided that we'll go by international standards, and the highest number will go by is 1:30. And Planning Commission Vice Chair person who, anyway, I won't go into the name, I do remember. So he opposed it to the extent that the whole committee actually walked out. And they said that if you have to decide, then what are we doing here? We are the expert committee. And we don't have to go by the constraints. We'll talk about constraints later, because these are not the things these are not bureaucratic decisions. We are not here as that. We are here to see what is desirable, what is that we need. And all that, a lot of drama happened, this, that, they were brought back, this. But ultimately, what's interesting is that RTE actually took those norms from the committee report. And now 1:30 is a legal norm in the country. And therefore, these things do matter. When you take a position, it does matter. It may or may not have become, because it's much later that the Act came into being, but Act went into the report and tried to look at many of those norms and incorporate those. So it's a combination of things, time, space, individuals, institutions, that makes a particular thing happen, and once it happens, it does remain there for long. Yeah, so thank you. These are the sources of those photos.
We have time for a few questions. Anybody has any?
So you mentioned.
Yes, yes.
You mentioned School in the Box program from Rishi was institutionalized in Karnataka. So I was wondering, that must have taken a massive teacher training program to do that. Right? As someone who grew up in Rishi Valley, I'm familiar with the program, the School in the Box. I think you call it Nalli Kali or something?
Nalli Kali.
Yeah. So how was that? How successful was that implementation on a large scale? And how did they train the teachers? It must have been a big effort to transition from the traditional education system to this. So
yeah, definitely.
If you could say more about that.
Yeah, if you go into research, you have both kinds of evidences. But then researches are of varying quality as well. So I won't know what to go by. I seriously, I've read some of those, and I really would rather not go by either side. I do feel that the quality is questionable. And if you talk to people, teachers and others, over a period, the opinion that I have formed is that basically if the teachers are good and interested, it works well. If they are not, it doesn't. Which happens in any kind of a classroom. I am aware of that. Still, I would say when it works, it seems to work better for children. And but then there are again, teachers argue that it's only in name. So I don't think I'm in a position to comment. Personally, I happen to, I had gone for something else, and since, I work in education, there is an interest. I was passing by Chamarajanagar district, I saw a school and I stopped and I went there. It was working very well. But that school seemed to be very exceptional because it was working well. One would like to believe it was not exceptional, but that's what everyone tells, that it could be exceptional. But it was working very well there. It had also a very good library, and students, one could see that they are used to using materials on their own. We did one small study of Nalli Kali and Kalika Yatna, which is another initiative here, a small. What we found that Kalika Yatna goes deeper into conceptual issues as compared to Nalli Kali, but Nalli Kali is easier to do on a scale. It demands less from teachers because it's a lot material dependent, unlike Kalika Yatna, where teachers are expected to initiate a lot of discussions. Again, if they do it well, it's perhaps better. So I would really, I won't have an answer in yes or no, or good or bad. I really don't know. In terms of learning achievement, Karnataka government own assessment is this, that it's not helping much. But then I personally feel that learning achievement, there are several ways of doing it, and how you do determines what kind of results you get. We did a study in Maharashtra, and Maharashtra government itself was, we actually showed that the situation is not as bad as everybody would like to believe. Children are actually learning, and children are knowing. They know many things. and they started saying that we did oral tests for class 2 children, because we literally fought for that. We thought, I mean, a middle class person, my 8-year-old child actually doesn't read everything fluently and comprehends every question fluently. And people who do not come from children who do not come from literate backgrounds find it much more difficult to comprehend the written questions, even if they know the concepts and answers. And then actually children did not do as badly as they expect them to, or as their own learning achievement surveys show. So it all depends also on how you do things, so. But again, I'm not saying that it's definitely very good. I would rather be ambiguous because I think it's grey. It's not really.
But the teachers were open to this new way of doing things. I mean, was it easy to sort of transition? How was that done?
Again, I'm not the best person because I'm not an insider in Karnataka. But what I can tell you from the fact that, around that time I did work and went to several states and helped states do these. Karnataka teachers, the advantage I'll tell you, Karnataka is the only state which has not gone completely, even Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya, which Tamil Nadu also has contract teachers, Karnataka doesn't have contract teachers. So in one sense, Karnataka has all permanent teachers. They are not necessarily very well paid. Teachers in Jharkhand, we realized, are much better paid, but it's a small section and the rest are so-called para teachers. So teachers here have been, in that sense, a more secure community. And a number of things that happen, for example, teachers transfer. Karnataka also has very good practice of litigation. They have these courts where they solve it then and there within district without going to legal. So teachers that way have a better standing here, and that helps in bringing a reform. So there was opposition. I know that because I knew Anita quite well, and but there was also support. And there were also the kind of trainings, a very kind of a passionate engagement. A large number of teachers were sent to Rishi Valley and other places where they were experimenting with these. So you do create a stake, which is what happened. And even today, when whatever limited recent exposure I had, I hear both kinds of stories. Some teachers saying it works very well, and some teachers saying that it doesn't. But majority, I feel, have accepted that as a system.
Take a question there. Yeah, go ahead.
So from your talk, I get a sense or impression that there are a set of people who make the policies. I was just wondering, do they take the opinion of a public person who are not connected with anything to do with education system or that sector? How do they just make the policy based on few people or set of people who are connected? Do they even take the opinion of some public citizens who are interested in this and have some good ideas, but they are not part of any of the education sector or connected in that?
Yeah. Perhaps if you are not connected anywhere, you will not figure. That's how I will put it. But certain policy making has been more inclusive than others. And so, as I said, for example, 86 policy, I was not working in education then, but you hear and large number of people and institutions like NGOs and academic world would talk about getting engaged, being asked to come and present, being called for meetings, being made part of task forces. So there was a consultative process which was broad. But if you didn't figure anywhere, how will you figure? Another example I have is National Curricular Framework 2005, because several task forces were made, 17 task forces were made. Each task force had at least 2 teachers in it, and they were again multidisciplinary. and it went beyond camps, like camps when I say. So for example, when I started working in education, I realized there was a Bodhya camp and there was an anti-Bodhya camp. So NCF process went beyond camps in terms of incorporating. Krishna Kumar, if you know, is a prominent educationist who headed NCRT at that point, and he was the one who did all that. And so for example, I was a member of one of those, and when I was called, I said, "Are you sure Krishna Kumar has he agreed on my name?" Because I thought he would not, because he was also anti-World Bank, and since I had worked for World Bank funded projects, so there was a kind of, I thought, I mean, not really, he has been actually very supportive in many things. So, so I would say that, but still, how broad in a country like ours. But some processes have definitely been much more inclusive, like midday meal, for example. It came from the movement and then found partners in bureaucracy. Mahila Samakhya, women's movement, played a major role in shaping that. But then it can also be, the thing is that it can also be a rhetoric. So, for instance, the new education policy that now we are expecting for the last 4 or 5 years, if you remember 4 or 5 years ago when the first move came, there was also a website where anybody could write letters. School management committees were asked to, and anybody could write letters. So then one fear was that this will be maneuvered by a particular camp. So these things can go either way, and therefore it's difficult to say what is inclusive, what is not. But in general, I would say that in my experience, it's not that all policy making has been very open and inclusive. Certain things do happen in closed door, but there is a kind of, and then it also depends on who. If you have, I mean, I have talked about a few officers, they out of so many, I've really worked with many of them, not worked as a colleague, but on various occasions as researchers, as different. Very few of them you see as committed, and ideology matters. So which ideology you are coming from, what do you want, because it can go whichever way it can. So difficult to.
Any short questions? Rafi.
Sort of curious, you referred to differences in Africa, you just sort of alluded to it. Maybe could you just tell us a little bit about what is different and what is similar?
Yeah, one, I as a young person had started working in these projects and became part of various negotiating processes also, and found all this very, I did learn a lot in terms of taking positions, in terms of arguing, in terms of not giving in, and vis-a-vis these multilateral, bilateral, especially the aid negotiations. And there, the important thing was that anything, and there will be a whole preparation towards that these are the things we are not agreeing to. And as part of negotiation, what are you giving in? So we'll give in something which we also want, but we will do it. Actually there used to be at times even rehearsals that we will make it look like as if it's coming from them and we are agreeing to it, but what is this that we want, and let us decide. So it was a process which was very, I'll say, rigorous in terms of actually sitting on those tables. Africa, what I found in many countries, one is that the economy size, what happens that the aid is a much bigger proportion of their economy. So your bargaining power really goes down. So it's not that, as I said, that despite being largest of a number of big multilaterals and bilaterals, it's less than 1% of our public expenditure. There it easily becomes 10%, 20%, 30%. And then what happens that your bargaining power goes down. So, what was kind of surprising to me initially, and finally one kind of understood and negotiated it differently, that they would actually give in to conditionalities of all kinds, even those which they themselves perhaps did not think the country would really agree to, in terms of, for example, language. Language, there's no formal language. It happened perhaps much before. I mean, World Bank cannot be made responsible for that. But still, the fact that you are allowing it to further completely being wiped out, that was one. In terms of policies, for a number of policies that you are, for example, the issue of teenage pregnancy is big in Africa, in most countries. Now, how you deal with it? Countries had their own policies, which perhaps were far more comprehensive, but the bank will have a particular kind of, something has worked in some particular, and it's not that Africa is one. Something has worked in Southern Africa, it will not work in Western Africa, which is far more Islamic, far more divided. But they will implant it there, and the country will agree to that. So in that sense, it was not a negotiation from a position of strength which I had experienced in India, except perhaps South Africa, which was different.
We'll take the rest of this, just in the interest of time, we'll take it outside. Jyotsna, if you have time, we'll have tea outside and continue this conversation. Let's thank Jyotsna again. Couple of notices. So I think I said this last time that we'll start on Friday from November. I lied. December is when we will start Fridays, and this coming December we actually have we'll have two talks, December 20th and 21st. 20th is looking at how particular countries around the world decided to make the case for going nuclear in the 1960s, sort of looking at stories around the Cold War and how people make those decisions, countries, states in particular. And 21st is looking at history of ecological conservation in India. So spread the word. Thanks again. Thanks for coming.